Let me start with something that might sound a little weird, but stay with me for a second. Imagine if your church or your community or even just your friend group decided that no one among you would go without. Now, not in some vague thoughts and prayers kind of way, but in a very real, very practical sense. Rent gets covered. Groceries get shared. Medical bills don't spiral people into debt because the group steps in. And not charity, shared responsibility. Now, ask yourself honestly, does that sound inspiring or does it sound impossible? Welcome to a special edition of Afterthoughts, which is a bonus segment of the weekly MTB podcast. There were so many interesting things to cover this week that I couldn't resist putting out an extra episode. I hope you enjoy it. Look, here's the tension we're facing. We love the idea of community, right up until it costs us something. I mean, we'll show up for the potluck, we'll volunteer for an hour, we'll post about caring for others, but when it comes to our time, our money, our resources, when it comes to actually restructuring how we live, suddenly things get complicated. And yet, if you go back to one of the most quoted sections of the Bible, you'll find a community that didn't just talk about caring for each other. They reorganized their entire lives around it. So the question isn't whether this idea exists. It's right there in the text. The question is why all of these self-proclaimed followers of Christ have quietly decided it doesn't really apply anymore. What does that say about the way we all choose comfort over consistency? So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. All right, let's go back and reread just 2 lines from one of our readings from the main episode this week. It's Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Now, notice what that doesn't say. It doesn't say they tithed 10%. It doesn't say they gave when it was convenient. It doesn't say they prayed about it and felt like that was enough. It says they sold things that they owned, real assets, and redistributed that value based upon need. That's not a metaphor. That's accounting. That's a liquidation strategy in service of collective survival. So here's the uncomfortable question right out of the gate. Why is it that so many believers will defend the virgin birth or the resurrection as being literal, non-negotiable truth? But when it comes to this, suddenly, that's symbolic. Or it's contextual. Or, that was a much different time. Isn't that interesting? The supernatural claims, boy, they're just locked in, but the economic demands get negotiable? Almost like one of those is much harder to actually live out than the other. And that's where we have to talk about selective literalism, because that's really what's going on here. Somewhere along the line, people decided that this part of the text didn't count the same way. And nobody voted on it. There wasn't a council that decided it. It just quietly shifted into the category of nice idea, but not practical. Now here's the problem. If you can dismiss the economic instructions of the early movement, the actual lived behavior of the people closest to the source of your claimed religion, then on what basis do you claim authority for anything else they said? You don't get to say, they were right about salvation, but wrong about money. That's not consistency. That's curation. And when apologists try to explain this away, they often fall back on what's called special pleading. Well, that was a temporary arrangement. Or that was for a specific crisis. Okay, maybe, but the text doesn't say that. In fact, it presents this as the natural outcome of being aligned with the highest ideals of the Jesus movement. This wasn't the emergency setting. It was the ideal setting, which means every modern church that hoards wealth, invests in real estate empires, or builds multi-million-dollar campuses while people in their own communities can't afford housing, that's not continuing the tradition. It's departing from it. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because if a believer is already choosing which parts of the text to follow and which parts to ignore, they're not actually following divine authority anymore. They're following personal preference. They're already doing what humanists do. They're evaluating ideas based on what they think makes sense. They've just kept the Christian branding intact. To be clear, if you claim to believe in sola scriptura, the Bible alone, and yet you pick and choose what you believe and don't believe, then you're not really the type of Christian you claim to be, because you're evaluating what to believe and what to follow. You don't refuse to wear a 50-50 polyester cotton blend because it violates biblical law. Or in 1 Timothy, Paul explicitly commands that women should not adorn themselves with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Are you following that one? Or in 1 Corinthians, Paul says women should remain silent in churches. They're not allowed to speak. Sola Scriptura proponents who allow women to pray, sing, or teach in any capacity are technically reinterpreting or bypassing this very direct and clear command. Now, people who claim sola scriptura may actually be practicing what's called prima scriptura, where the Bible is the primary authority, but their own cultural tradition determines which parts are considered literal and which are considered metaphorical. Either way, they claim to believe in divine authority as long as they get to define for themselves what that authority is telling them. Anyway, let's zoom out a bit, because what Acts chapter 2 is describing isn't just generosity. It's a completely different architecture of how people should live together. And we tend to confuse that with charity, which is not the same thing. Charity is hierarchical. Charity is, I have extra and I'll give you a piece of my extra. Right? There's still a power dynamic there. There's still ownership and control, and often, if we're being honest, a little bit of ego baked in. What Acts chapter 2 describes is mutual aid. It's not about giving from our excess. It's about redefining ownership entirely. If I have 2 coats and you have none, the question isn't whether I'm generous enough to give one away. The question is why I ever thought both coats were mine in the first place while you were cold. That's a very different mindset. That's not charity. That's solidarity. And this is where modern economic thinking, especially in the U.S., has completely flipped the script. We've been steeped in this idea that success is individual, that wealth is a sign of merit, and that helping others, that's optional. The so-called Protestant work ethic has been blended with capitalism in a way that turns accumulation into a frickin' virtue. But if you hold that up next to Acts chapter 2, the contrast is pretty stark. One says, build as much as you can for yourself. The other says, make sure no one around you is struggling, even if it costs you something. And before anyone says, well, nobody actually lives like that, let me stop you right there. There have been groups throughout history who have tried. The Diggers in 17th century England. Go look them up. The Hutterites, who still exist today. Right? Communities that said, no, we're going to take this seriously. And do you know who often opposed them? Do you know who was often just almost violently against what they were doing? Other Christians. Not because they were failing, but because they were too successful at actually living the text of the Bible. It was too disruptive and too inconvenient. So let's bring this into the present, because it's easy to critique institutions, but the real question is, what do we do with this? And this is where I'm going to push a little on the humanist side of the audience too. Right? If you don't believe there's a divine safety net, if you don't think there's a higher power who's going to swoop in and fix everything, then the responsibility shifts entirely to us. There is no bailout from above. There is only what we build together, which means the idea of a common purse, whether that's healthcare systems, social safety nets, climate action, or just local mutual aid. That common purse becomes even more urgent, not less. But here's the catch. Modern life is designed to keep us from feeling that urgency. We're physically separated. We're socially segmented, algorithmically filtered. We don't see each other's needs up close, so we can pretend they're not our problem. The earliest Christian communities didn't have that luxury. They were in proximity. They saw other people's hunger. They saw the struggle. And once you see it up close and personal, it's a lot harder to ignore. So maybe the question isn't whether Acts chapter 2 is realistic. Maybe the question is whether we've built a world that makes it easier to avoid living that way. And if we're serious about this, whether you're coming from a religious background or a humanist one, then we have to start asking, what would a common purse actually look like today? Not in theory, but in practice. For example, tool libraries. Instead of everyone buying their own stuff, you go borrow the tool you need. Housing co-ops, community refrigerators, time banking systems. These things exist. Local networks where people trade skills and support instead of just transactions where I pay you to do something for me. Now, these aren't fantasies. They already exist in small pockets here and there. The question is whether we're willing to expand them or whether we're more comfortable staying in systems that benefit us individually. So I am by no means perfect. My wife and I donate a lot, but we've also accumulated a lot. But we both advocate for and agree with laws, regulations, and policies that create social safety nets and focus on helping those who have less. And we're happy to pay taxes when that money goes to supporting programs like that. No, we're not perfect. But honestly, I would much rather have a conversation with an atheist who shares their sandwich than with a believer who prays for me while clutching their stock portfolio. Because at some point, what you do matters more than what you say you believe. If you claim the entire Bible is sacred, you don't get to treat it like a buffet. You don't get to pile your plate with the parts that feel good and leave the parts that cost you something. And if you're not willing to sacrifice your excess to meet real human needs, then maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop calling that book truth and start calling it what it has truly become for you: optional. Because here's the reality. The early church was a commune that looked like a miracle. The modern church is often a corruption that looks a hell of a lot like a country club. So which one actually values human life? Here's the question I'll leave you with this week. If you're a believer, ask your pastor why Acts chapter 2 isn't the blueprint for your church's budget. And if you're a humanist, ask yourself why you're still waiting for someone else to do what we could already be doing for each other. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. Before I let you go, I want to remind you to head on over to thecodaproject.com to check out all the content I'm working on. I'm trying very hard to build an online content ecosystem that's focused on values-based living. The Mythologizing the Bible content, which you're obviously familiar with, draws out secular humanist lessons from the weekly readings from the Roman Catholic Lectionary. If you like this content, then I'm sure you'd like my other content, which is designed to help you live a values-based life. The Weekly Compass is a tool to help you explore one core value at a time. And Kitchen Table Activism helps you put your core values into action politically, right from the comfort of your own home. You know, if people worried less about ideological divisions and focused more on ensuring their words and actions aligned with positive core values, our world would be a much, much better place for everyone. So make sure you check out thecodaproject.com and subscribe to be on my mailing list. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.